were born into a toxic family. You were probably told the same story over and over. You're too sensitive. You're dramatic. You overthink everything. And eventually, you started believing that your pain was your personality. But that's what most people never realize. The awakening doesn't begin in peace. It begins in contradiction. It begins when you read a child who can feel the emotional temperature of the room before anyone speaks. When you can predict arguments like weather, when you learn to read micro-expressions, tone shifts, and silence because silence in your home wasn't calm. It was danger. Modern psychology calls this hypervigilance. The nervous system becomes trained to scan for threats, not because you're weak, but because your environment required it. Your brain learned one rule early. Stability is temporary, so you adapted, not in a heroic way, in a survival way. You became the peacemaker, the achiever, the invisible one, the one who always apologizes first, even when you did nothing wrong. The one who carries the emotional burden of everyone else because you were punished for having needs. And that's where the toxic family structure becomes a machine. Because toxic families don't run on truth. They run on roles. One person becomes the golden child, rewarded for loyalty and performance. Another becomes the scapegoat, blamed for the tension everyone refuses to face. Someone becomes the lost child, emotionally neglected but praised for being easy. Someone becomes the hero, forced to grow up too soon. And behind it all, there's usually an unspoken rule. Dante sposi what really happening here. This is why awakened souls often feel like aliens in their own home. Not because they're special in an arrogant way, but because they can't unsee the pattern. They notice the emotional manipulation. They notice how love is given like a paycheck only when you perform. They noticed how the family doesn't actually want connection. It wants control. And control is often disguised as concern. Where are you going? Who are you with? Why are you acting different? You've changed. But what they really mean is, you're breaking the script we wrote for you. Alan Watts would say that most human suffering comes from resisting what is but. Toxic families create a different kind of suffering. They force you to resist yourself. They train you to abandon your instincts, to doubt your perception, to betray your own emotional reality. That's why the first stage of awakening is not enlightenment. It's disorientation. You start realizing you weren't too sensitive. You were simply the only one paying attention. You weren't difficult. You were the only one refusing to pretend. You weren't ungrateful. You were exhausted from carrying what was never yours to carry. And once you begin waking up, the family system reacts like a threatened organism, because when one person stops playing their role, the entire structure becomes unstable. The scapegoat stops absorbing the blame. The golden child stops seeking approval. The peacemaker stops fixing everything. And suddenly, the truth rises to the surface. This is when the guilt tactics intensify. They may call you selfish for setting boundaries. They may accuse you of thinking you're better than us. They may suddenly become kind, not out of love, but out of strategy. They may rewrite history in real time and insist your memories are wrong. Modern psychology calls this gap, but spiritually, it's something even deeper. It's what happens when the ego senses it's losing its grip, because toxic families often function as a shared ecosystem, a collective identity built on denial, appearances, and emotional bargaining. And you're the one who interrupts it. Not because you wanted war, but because you wanted truth. And truth is disruptive. So if you've ever wondered, why me? Why you had to be born into the chaos? Why you had to grow up too fast? Why you had to heal things you didn't break? Here's the answer most people won't say. Some souls are born into toxic families because they are the pattern breakers, not to punish them, but to wake them. Because when you survive emotional disorder long enough, you start craving something deeper than comfort. You start craving freedom. Not freedom from people, but freedom from the invisible chains inside you. The fear of disappointing others, the addiction to approval, the instinct to shrink, the habit of self-abandonment. And the moment you see that clearly, the awakening begins, not with light, but with the realization that you were never crazy. You were just born into a system that needed you asleep, and now you're waking up. The moment you begin to heal, the first thing you notice is this. Your family doesn't celebrate it. They don't say, "I'm proud of you." They don't say, "You look healthier." They don't say, "I'm glad you're finally choosing yourself." Instead, they get uncomfortable. They start acting strange, subtle at first. A cold tone, a sarcastic comment, a sudden change in energy when you enter the room. Because in toxic families, your growth isn't seen as progress. It's seen as rebellion. And the reason is simple. The version of you that healed is harder to control. When you were emotionally dependent, they could pull your strings with guilt. When you were insecure, they could shape your identity with criticism. When you were desperate for approval, they could reward you with tiny scraps of affection. But healing changes the game. You start saying no without explaining yourself. You stop begging to be understood. You stop proving your worth. You stop apologizing for existing into a toxic family system that feels like betrayal. Not because you did something wrong, but because you stopped playing your assigned role. If you were the peacemaker, they'll accuse you of starting drama the moment you stop fixing everything. If you were the scapegoat, they'll panic when their favorite target no longer reacts. If you were the achiever, they'll suddenly downplay your success because it reminds them of their own stagnation. This is the part nobody prepares you for. Sometimes the people who claim to love you only love the version of you that suffers quietly, because that version is predictable. That version stays close. That version keeps the peace. That version never exposes the truth. But the awakened version of you does something dangerous. You see through the performance. You realize love without respect is not love. You realize loyalty without boundaries is self-destruction. You realize family can be a biological connection and still be emotionally unsafe. And once you realize that, you can't pretend anymore. Alan Watts often spoke about how the ego builds identities like prisons. Toxic families are full of ego contracts, unspoken deals like, "I'll accept you as long as you stay small. I'll support you as long as you don't outgrow me. I'll love you as long as you don't make me look bad. I'll be kind as long as you don't bring up the past." So when you start healing, you break the contract. And the system responds the only way it knows how. It tries to pull you back into the old reality. That's why they might suddenly bring up your mistakes from years ago. They might mock your boundaries. They might call your therapy brainwashing. They might accuse you of being cold just because you're calm. Because to them, calm is suspicious. Calm means you're no longer emotionally hooked. Calm means their chaos isn't controlling you anymore. Calm means you found something inside yourself that they can't touch. And that's what awakened souls learn the hard way. Toxic families don't fear your anger. They fear your detachment. They fear the moment you stop arguing, stop defending, stop explaining, stop begging. Because once you stop reacting, their power collapses. And here's the most brutal truth. They may never become the family you deserved, but you can still become the person you were meant to be. not by fighting them, not by proving anything, but by stepping out of the role they wrote for you, and finally writing your own.
In a toxic family, empathy isn't a gift. It becomes a weapon used against you. Because when you're naturally emotionally intelligent, you don't just hear words. You hear what people mean. You feel what they're hiding. You sense tension before it becomes visible. And in a healthy environment, that sensitivity becomes wisdom. But in a toxic home, it becomes survival. You learn to read moods like a soldier reads footsteps. You learn who's safe to talk to and when. You learn how to speak carefully, how to be agreeable, how to disappear emotionally while still being physically present. Not because you're weak, because you were trained. Modern psychology explains this clearly. Children adapt to instability by becoming hyper-aware of emotional cues. Your nervous system becomes tuned to threat, not joy. You become good at sensing danger, but terrible at trusting peace. That's why even in adulthood, you may struggle with things that look small to everyone else. You over-explain yourself. You apologize too quickly. You feel guilty for resting. You assume people are mad at you and they're simply quiet. And the worst part? You often don't even realize it's happening. Because it feels normal. When you grow up in chaos, calm feels unfamiliar. Silence feels like punishment. Neutral faces feel like rejection. So you become addicted to reading people. You scan constantly. You predict reactions. You adjust your personality like a mask. And eventually, you forget what your real face looks like. This is why awakened souls often feel exhausted in relationships. Not because they're antisocial, but because they're always working, always managing energy, always managing emotions, always making sure nobody gets upset, even when it's not their job. Toxic families teach you a dangerous belief. If someone is unhappy, it must be your fault. So you become the emotional caretaker. You become the therapist to people who never asked if you were okay. You become the listener to people who never listened to you. You become the fixer in a system that was never meant to be fixed. And if you're honest, part of you believed this would finally earn love. If you were good enough, quiet enough, helpful enough, successful enough, maybe they would change. But they didn't, because toxic people don't reward empathy. They exploit it. They take your kindness as permission. They take your patience as weakness. They take your forgiveness as a blank check. And that's where the awakening begins. Not when you become cold, but when you become clear. You start realizing that empathy without boundaries is self-harm. You start realizing that understanding someone doesn't mean you have to tolerate them. You start realizing that compassion doesn't require proximity. Alan Watts would say life is like a dance flowing, changing, moving. But toxic families don't want you to dance. They want you to stay in one place. They want you to be predictable, easy to manipulate, easy to guilt, easy to pull back in. And your empathy makes you vulnerable to that pull. Because you don't want to hurt them. You don't want to abandon them. You don't want to be the bad one. But here's the truth that sets awakened souls free. You are not responsible for people who refuse to heal. You are not obligated to keep suffering just because they're comfortable with your pain. And the moment you stop trying to save them, you finally start saving yourself. That's not selfish. That's awakening.
One of the strangest parts of awakening is this. You can finally see the toxicity clearly, yet you still feel guilty for stepping away. Even when you know the relationship is damaging, even when you know the environment is unhealthy, even when you know you're not imagining it, you still hesitate. You still sekanges. Yourself, and you start asking the question that traps millions of people in emotional prison. Am I a bad person for wanting distance from my own family? Toxic families install guilt like software, not through one dramatic moment, but through years of small emotional conditioning. You were taught that love means sacrifice, that loyalty means endurance, that family is everything, no matter what. So when you finally choose peace, it doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like betrayal, because guilt isn't just an emotion. It's a leash. And toxic families pull that leash the moment they sense you slipping away. They don't say, "We miss you." They say, "After everything we've done for you." They don't say, "We're proud you're building your life." They say, "You think you're too good for us now." They don't say, "We want you to be happy." They say, "So you're really just going to abandon your family?" It's not love. It's emotional debt collection. Modern psychology calls this fog, fear, obligation, and guilt. Fear of being hated, obligation to stay loyal, guilt for choosing yourself. And if you grew up in a toxic home, you didn't learn boundaries naturally. You learned survival. So when you try to set boundaries as an adult, your body reacts like you're committing a crime. Your heart races, your stomach tightens, your mind spirals, not because you're wrong, but because your nervous system was trained to believe that saying no equals danger. That's why you might feel physically anxious after doing something healthy. You decline a call and feel sick. You cancel a visit and feel ashamed. You speak up and feel like you did something evil. Toxic families condition you to associate your independence with punishment, because in that system, your freedom threatens their control. And here's the part most people don't understand. Your guilt is often not proof you're doing something wrong. It's proof you were trained to put yourself last. Alan Watts spoke about how humans cling to identities that create suffering. In toxic families, the identity they give you is usually one of these: the good son, the good daughter, the responsible one, the one who never causes trouble, the one who keeps the family together. And if you step away, you don't just leave the people, you leave the identity. That's why it feels like death. Because part of you was built around being needed, built around being useful, built around earning love through emotional labor. So when you stop, you feel empty at first. You feel like you've lost your purpose. But that emptiness isn't a flaw. It's space. Space for a new identity that isn't based on suffering. And the truth is, awakened souls don't leave because they hate their families. They leave because they finally love themselves enough to stop bleeding in places that never heal. They leave because they realize that family is not a permission slip for abuse. They leave because they understand something deep. Staying loyal to dysfunction is not virtue. It's self-destruction. So, if you feel guilty for choosing distance, remember this: you're not abandoning them. You're abandoning the version of yourself that believed pain was the price of belonging. And that's not cruelty, that's liberation. After you grow up in a toxic family, you think the nightmare ends when you leave. But then something strange happens. You start meeting the same people in different bodies: a controlling boss, a manipulative partner, a friend who drains you, someone who praises you one day and punishes you the next, and you don't understand why it keeps repeating. You tell yourself, "I'm smarter now. I know the signs. I won't fall for it again." Yet somehow the pattern returns. Because toxic families don't just traumatize you, they program your nervous system. They teach your body what love feels like. And if love felt unpredictable, conditional, and emotionally unsafe, your system may confuse peace with boredom. You may confuse stability with a lack of chemistry. You may confuse kindness with weakness. That's why awakened souls often struggle in the beginning stages of healing, not because they don't want healthy love, but because healthy love feels unfamiliar. It doesn't trigger adrenaline. It doesn't create anxiety. It doesn't force you to chase. And if you were raised on emotional chaos, chasing feels normal. Modern psychology explains this through attachment patterns. If you grew up with inconsistency, you may develop an anxious attachment style, always seeking reassurance, always afraid of being left, always trying to earn love. Or you may develop avoidant attachment, keeping distance, staying guarded, acting independent, while secretly craving connection. Sometimes you become both. You crave intimacy, but panic when it arrives, because deep down, your nervous system learned this lesson. Closeness equals danger. So you attract what you understand, not what you deserve. And the most dangerous part is how familiar toxicity feels. A narcissistic person will feel confident. A manipulator will feel charismatic. An emotionally unavailable person will feel mysterious. A hot and cold lover will feel exciting. But what you're really feeling is not attraction. It's activation. It's the old wound lighting up. It's the same childhood environment recreated in adult form, and your subconscious thinks, if I can finally win love here, I'll heal the past. That's why you stay too long. That's why you forgive too quickly. That's why you explain your pain to people who enjoy causing it. Because you're not just dating a person. You're negotiating with your history. Alan Watts would say the mind clings to suffering because it's known territory. The ego prefers a familiar hell over an unfamiliar heaven. So you repeat the pattern until you become conscious of it. And awakening is exactly that. Consciousness. You begin to notice the red flags early. They rush intimacy. They test boundaries. They punish honesty. They make you feel guilty for having needs. They twist your words. They blame you for their behavior. And here's the key shift. Instead of asking, how do I make them love me? You start asking, why am I attracted to someone who makes me feel unsafe? That question changes everything, because the goal isn't to become colder. The goal is to become clear, to recognize that peace is not boring. Peace is what your nervous system was denied. To understand that consistency is not too easy. Consistency is emotional maturity. To accept that real love doesn't demand you suffer to prove loyalty. Real love doesn't make you shrink. Real love doesn't punish your growth. And when you finally stop chasing what hurts you, you start attracting something different. Not because the world changed, but because you did. You stopped confusing intensity with intimacy. You stopped mistaking attention for affection. You stopped calling chaos home. And that's when the cycle breaks. Not through revenge, not through proving anything, but through awakening to your worth. There's a moment in every awakened person's life where the story collapses. Not the story you tell other people. The story you told yourself. The one that says, maybe I'm the difficult one. Maybe I'm too emotional. Maybe I'm ungrateful. Maybe I ruin everything. Because toxic families don't just hurt you. They rewrite you. They don't simply criticize your behavior. They attack your identity. And over time, you stop seeing yourself as a person with normal human reactions and start seeing yourself as the problem that needs fixing. This is why the scapegoat role is so psychologically brutal. If you were the one blamed for tension, you were trained to carry emotional responsibility that didn't belong to you. When they fought, it was your fault. When they were stressed, it was your fault. When they were unhappy, it was your fault. When the family felt unstable, it was your fault. And what's terrifying is how convincing it becomes. Because When you're a child, you don't have the power to say, this is dysfunctional. You only have the power to adapt. So you internalize the blame. You develop a deep belief that you are inherently wrong. That belief doesn't disappear when you grow up. It follows you into adulthood like a shadow. You may become a perfectionist, always trying to earn peace. You may become a people pleaser, always trying to prevent conflict. You may become an overachiever, always trying to prove your worth. Or you may shut down completely because trying never worked anyway. But then something happens. You start learning. You read about emotional abuse. You hear someone describe your childhood perfectly. You discover words like narcissistic patterns, emotional neglect, gaslighting, trauma bonding, and suddenly your entire life makes sense. You realize your reactions weren't random. They were predictable outcomes of an unpredictable environment. Your anxiety wasn't weakness. It was conditioning. Your anger wasn't a flaw. It was suppressed truth. Your sadness wasn't drama. It was grief. Modern psychology explains this clearly. Children who grow up in emotionally unsafe homes often develop coping mechanisms that look like personality traits. Hyperindependence, emotional numbness, chronic guilt, overthinking, fear of intimacy, fear of abandonment. But those aren't who you are. Those are survival strategies. Alan Watts would say that suffering comes from misidentification, believing you are your thoughts, your labels, your roles. Toxic families give you a role and call it you. They say, you're the selfish one, you're the unstable one, you're the disappointment, you're the problem. But awakened souls eventually see the truth. The family system needed someone to carry the blame so everyone else could avoid accountability. And once you understand that, the shame begins to dissolve, because shame thrives in isolation and confusion. It survives when you think you're alone. But when you see the pattern, you stop taking it personally. You start seeing it structurally. You weren't too much. You were too aware. You weren't hard to love. You were hard to control. You weren't broken. You were reacting normally to an abnormal environment. And here's the deepest shift of all. You stop trying to convince them. You stop trying to get them to admit it. You stop trying to force closure from people who survive by denying reality, because the closure is internal. The closure is the moment you say, I know what happened to me. I know what it did to me, and I'm done carrying what was never mine. That's awakening, not a burst of light, not a spiritual fantasy, but a quiet, unshakable recognition. You were never the problem. You were the one who saw the truth first. The final stage of awakening isn't revenge. It isn't proving them wrong. It isn't winning an argument that was never fair. It isn't waiting for an apology that may never come. The final stage is something quieter and far more powerful. You stop trying to return to a place that harmed you, because deep down, the wounded version of you still hoped for one impossible thing, that one day they would become the family you needed, that one day they would finally see you, finally understand you, finally love you without conditions, finally admit what they did, finally change. And that hope is what keeps people stuck for years. Not because hope is weak, but because hope can become a chain when it's attached to the wrong people. Healing begins when you realize you don't need their transformation to have your own. You don't need their permission to move on. You don't need them to agree with your reality for your reality to be true. Because awakened souls learn the most brutal truth. Some people will never validate your pain because their identity depends on denying it. If they admit they hurt you, They must face themselves. If they face themselves, they must feel guilt. If they feel guilt, they must change. And many people would rather protect their ego than protect their child. So they rewrite history. They minimize. They blame you. They call you dramatic. They call you ungrateful. But here's what awakening teaches you. Their denial does not erase your experience. Their refusal to understand does not mean you're wrong. Their inability to love you properly does not mean you're unlovable. Alan Watts often spoke about how life moves like a river, always changing, always flowing. But toxic families want you frozen in time. They want you to stay the same child, the same holy, the same emotional servant, because your growth exposes their stagnation. And that's why true healing isn't just getting better. It's becoming unrecognizable to the version of you that once begged for crumbs. You stop chasing love. You stop chasing approval. You stop chasing peace from people who only know conflict. You begin building something new. A new nervous system, a new identity, a new standard, a new life. And this is where many people feel grief. Not because they missed the abuse, but because they finally accept what they never had. They grieve the childhood they deserved, the protection they needed, the tenderness they were denied. They grieve the fantasy of a safe family. And that grief is sacred, because grief is the funeral of illusion. It is the moment you stop lying to yourself. And after grief comes freedom. Freedom is not, I don't care anymore. Freedom is, I care, but I don't abandon myself to prove it. Freedom is knowing you can love people from a distance. You can forgive without returning. You can release resentment without reopening the door. Because boundaries are not hatred. Boundaries are clarity. And awakened souls don't heal to become acceptable to toxic people. They heal to become whole. They heal to stop repeating the pattern, to stop choosing chaos, to stop tolerating disrespect, to stop shrinking for love. They heal so their future children, whether literal or symbolic, never have to survive what they survive. And that is the deepest purpose behind being born into a toxic family. Not to be destroyed by it, but to be the one who ends it. Not with violence, not with cruelty, but with consciousness, with self-respect, with the courage to walk away from what's familiar and step into what's true. Because your awakening was never meant to bring you back to the old world. It was meant to set you free. If this video made you uncomfortable, that's a good sign. Growth doesn't come from comfort, it comes from clarity. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because this channel is built on dialogue, not noise. Like the video if it gave you perspective, subscribe if you're serious about mastering yourself, and remember, self-respect always comes first. Everything else follows.